what's new in the land of DORA? I think the biggest thing, in case you haven't seen it, and I'm gonna actually jump over here to dora.dev, is that we did publish some early findings from this year's report. So if you go to research 2024, and I'll, Dave, if you could add the link in the chat to the actual page to make it easier for everyone, but then you can go under here under AI preview, and we have published some of the early findings that the researchers have found from this year's data to get you a little bit of something before the report comes out later this fall. And then also, if you haven't yet, we have published the core V2, so I encourage you to take a look at that as well. And I'm gonna pass it over to Neil Davis. So Neil is the Vice President of Engineering at OM1, a clinical healthcare data company. He is a habitual startup VP and has been solving problems with data for the last 20 plus years, with a large chunk of that spent in the healthcare tech space. Now, I met Neil last fall at DevOps Days Boston when he was giving a presentation that was titled Data Pipelines for Operational Metrics. And that was a very interesting talk, but the thing that just struck me and what led me to bring up to him and ask him if he would come and speak to the community was the way he had mentioned in his talk how he was using those metrics for good, how he had been able to translate and talk to executives about what their teams needed and how they were doing without having those metrics at the team level, especially DORA metrics, being weaponized. So I'm very thankful to have Neil here today, and I will pass it over to him.
Thank you. All right, I'll try and get through these in somewhat promptly. So yeah, this up to the right isn't always good. I know we always talk about things going up and people like that, and it's really about how we can get better at reporting metrics up to our sort of leadership teams. First up, these are my opinions, not OM1's, so just be aware of that. This is me talking, not OM1. And then with that, I'll jump in. So if we talk about the problem that I'm trying to address here, is that engineering metrics generally don't land well with leadership. We have a lot of metrics we find useful, or the industry recognizes best practices, and when we go and present to leadership, sometimes they just don't get it, right? They're too detached from the processes, and the challenge is to really understand what they mean and how moving these metrics in a meaningful way actually has a positive impact on your organization. So I'm going to talk about a scenario. So like you're asked to present to leadership on some engineering metrics. You put together this great little slide presentation. Here's a nice little AI-generated picture of you doing it with your what looks like a mini lightsaber. Anyway, you're going through, you're super proud of your metrics. You're particularly proud of like this work your team did about upgrading their code base. There was all these old Python libraries. It was horrible. It was a mess. You went through, you upgraded them all. And all of a sudden you're there talking about how like, everything's going up to the right. It looks good. You feel like you're suddenly like you're at stand-up and you've been like cracking jokes and they're falling flat. Everyone's just looking at you or in their phone. They've got no idea what you're talking about. Right? This is kind of like what it's like often when you like stand up there and actually try and present some engineering metrics, right? You've put together these numbers, they're great. You've got like this tracking about, how your third-party libraries are going to help understand your risk exposure and vulnerabilities. And you've figured out that you want to do a percentage of libraries against the, how them up fully up to date against the latest version. They've got no idea what you're talking about. This kind of happens a lot. So at least in this one here, you've got it going up to the right, so your executives will be happy. So what do they actually care about? What's the most impact to them? Kind of break it down to 3 buckets, revenue. And when I talk about sort of revenue, I'm lumping sort of revenue and bookings together here. They are different, and depending upon your type of business, they kind of impact differently, but it's more like cash in. Cost management, they care a lot about cost management. No, I'm saying cost management, not cost reduction. At some point, quite often there's no point trying to reduce your cost because you've signed up to spend however many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars with Amazon every year, and you get below that, you're just kind of throwing that money away. Also, sometimes you may not, you may be a growing business. Your costs aren't going to go down, but if you can show and demonstrate how you're managing them, executives like that. And then the last piece, which is capital, really only your finance team's going to care about this. Unless you're working off expensive equipment and you have lots of it, it's really not going to apply. But the idea is that if you've tied up a whole bunch of capital somewhere else, in long term, ideally you could be using that cash elsewhere. So let's sort of drill in a little bit more into these, break it down a bit more. So what do we mean by revenue? What are the things that they care about? Let's get down to things that we kind of know and can talk about, or they can talk about a lot. So if you're in a B2B world, renewals, upsells, you got your customers out there. How can we make sure we're getting more renewals and getting our customers spending more? How can we bring in new business? Like, these are the things that executives really care about. And if you're in sort of a metered sort of world, things like increased consumption, whether that's, literally, with cloud spend where it's like a meter running and the more you do, the more you spend. Or in B2C, that could be things like getting more eyeballs looking at your website or whatever, that's going to then drive more ad revenue and things like that. So it's about getting that cash in. Cost management, we like to think about cost in terms of two types. I like to think of it as hard costs, which are things like your cloud spend. That's money that's literally going out the door to somewhere else. And then there's the opportunity costs. So you may have improved some efficiency. So someone is spending less time on a task. That means they can potentially spend that doing other things that drive business value. So we want to break it down to sort of these buckets. And then capital, as talked about it before, less purchased equipment, get rid of it. We've reduced the amount of bare metal we have in our data centers, something like that. The cost of capital does vary over time. If you think back to 3-4 years ago in the days of ZIRP, like, it was free. It didn't matter. Capital didn't really matter. We could, money was free. Now, ZIRP is no more. So the cost of capital is important to us. So I'm moving along here. So this is a slightly controversial at times. And it's often like, how do people view your engineering department? Ultimately, how you are viewed by your leadership team and how you impact the business is going to sort of help you be able to land your metrics a little better, or even change perception of this. So generally, I found that a lot of executives, when they're looking at engineering, are thinking of it in terms of, that just costs a lot of money, right? They just see money. My engineering team's expensive. Engineers are expensive. They keep running up these giant AWS bills. There's revenue. Okay, my engineering team's out there driving revenue, or they're driving innovation. So how do you know what one they're thinking of you are? If you're a cost driver, you're not seen as the primary revenue driver. Other teams are delivering the value. So classically, IT is in a cost driver. If your infrastructure team is often and low down in the stack, they're kind of considered more that way. And a good way to think about that is when leadership's sort of celebrating things, who's getting the shout outs? If your team is not getting a shout out because of some new business deal or some project success, they're thinking of you down as a cost, not actually driving a lot of business value. Revenue, your work is tied directly to revenue. This is like, client services. You work on projects, project finish, we celebrate it. Yay, you're driving revenue. And innovation, this is the interesting bucket, this last. And I mean by direct innovation, driving business value for your customer, not necessarily being innovative in how you build and deploy your product, because there you're just being innovative in terms of how you manage your costs through increased efficiency. So it's really trying to drive that extra business value for your customer, getting ahead, so to speak, of the competition. Let's talk about how these metrics align to these buckets. So in terms of cost, we're looking at efficiencies, risk reduction, lowering capital, right? So things like hard costs, if you can demonstrate how you're managing your cloud spend, realizing savings, reducing risk, all important things. That can also tie into sort of even in the cost function, you can actually tie yourself into renewals as well. We can talk a bit more about that later. And then in terms of revenue, obviously things like margin, like how much you're actually generating in terms of margin between your costs and your revenue, important for a revenue team. And one of the interesting one here is speed to recognize revenue. The faster you can deliver the work, the more time you can, quicker is to get that money in, and then you can actually get working on other things. Your finance team loves that. And then the innovation is sort of interesting as well, because these are the metrics that I find really sort of give you an example or an idea around how to demonstrate how much you're innovating. And that's around metrics around experimentation, your speed of innovation, and around how much business value you are delivering to your end customer. So a few other factors as well, as you're sort of tying this in, presenting out to your leadership. Unambiguous numbers are best. And what I mean by that is, like, if you save, like, cost 15%, deliver 10% more revenue, and you can attribute that back to yourself, that's great. What you got to remember is, like, you know, there's that term, was a success is like 1,000 fathers, and, you know, failure is an orphan, right? You want to be, like, recognized as part of that success. So make sure that you can then tie that into those revenues. If you are having a methodology to calculate an amount, so it's not just straight up, look, we saved this much money, your manner in which you calculate the amount of money you're saving or cost that you're incurring, right? People have got to understand that and have bought into that methodology. So for example, if you're quantifying, like, the risk of us running into some critical vulnerability, like, you've got to be able to quantify what that is in a way in which the people understand and accept. This is hard, so often trends are a more digestible approach. And I find this generally works well with a lot of executives, is that if you put numbers up, they often really like it if you can see trends over time, especially with risk, because they can go, oh, I'm comfortable with where we are right now, but it's getting worse. Okay, what does that mean? And you can have a conversation then about what the relative values are. Can people talk about it? Also, if it's going down in terms of getting better, people are like, cool, great, right. I'm not sure what that means, but it's looking good. We like it. And another piece of this is super important, is the commentary is as important, if not more important, than the numbers. You can't just put up a metrics of slides. You've got to kind of, like, put lots of call outs on and say, look, this is what this means and why. And that should be the top of conversations when you are presenting with your leadership, is the call outs. That's what you talk about. And then when people understand more, you drill into the numbers. All right, so I'm going to dig in here. We're really going to get into here some numbers, which I have found to have worked in the past. And these are probably what a bunch of you may be interested in, I hope. So I'm trying to tie this up into sort of like the buckets in terms of things that executives like, and then how you can tie metrics that you are aware of, that are familiar on the right, across, and how to sort of bridge that. So renewals. Why do customers renew? Because the quality is good. It does the performance of the product is good. And there's incremental improvement happening over time, right? So you want to make sure that you have metrics around quality. So a good one that we have, that we track, is like, what of our bugs that are getting recorded, what are meeting within our SLA? So we have a priority, and I think our P1 we do within a week, maybe 5. I can't remember what exactly, it's 3 or 5 days, and then within 2 weeks for a P2 bug. How quickly can we address those, and how many are getting addressed within that? Performance, if we've got web applications, I'd like to look at the 95th percentile load speed. Like, is that going up or down? If our load speed is getting higher and higher and higher, we know that we might start having customers complain about performance. And the context is important here. If people are aware of performance problems and they see it getting better, they'll be generally quite happy. You can also do something as well with your ML models. Like, you can track to see how well your machine learning models are doing over time. And are they trending up? Are they getting worse? Are you having to retrain your models on a regular basis? And are they even self-learning and tracking the performance of them? SLA is super important to meet. So how are we doing? Is our uptime over time versus our objective? If you find yourself getting too close to it, that also can be problems with renewals. A couple of the DORA metrics here are good to tie in as well. So time to restore service and a change failure rate tracked over time. Tracking DORA metrics over time is a little tricky, because you kind of like look at like your typical frequency of being able to do these things. So you kind of like have to define your buckets, and the math for it can get a little complicated at times. But they are good metrics to track in terms of how quickly are we recovering from potential issues. And then similarly, the ability to ship new features. I've got a little pop up here in my way here, so I can't read this one. So yeah, one of the things I like here is predictability. Like, we like to have well-defined sprints, and we'd like to track how many of the sprints are actually getting done according to what you predicted to do. If we're unpredictable, it's pretty hard to reliably ship out new features. So that's one thing we keep track of. And I call it the shovel-ready backlog, which is how quickly do you have, how much work do you have that's ready to go that allows you to be a little bit more agile and nimble And if you can track that over time, you can then basically say, okay, we have this load of work that we go to. If this suddenly becomes higher priority for business reasons, we can immediately take action upon it. So new customers, similar ones here. This is pretty much a repeat here because these are the kind of things that we can track, because new customers are a little harder to sort of track through, but it's a similar thing. Ability to ship new features tracks back to a similar amount of things, and same with things like if you're working in the machine learning space, being able to track the performance of your models. Innovation, this is a more interesting one. If you're early stage, experiments are super important. Like if you're running experiments to see if people are going to like particular features, or if there's demand for things, A/B testing and stuff, you really want to be tracking your number you ran over time and what ones actually had, and what the percentage of those that are having meaningful results. There's no point running lots of experiments if every time it's not giving you anything. It's kind of a wasted experiment to a certain degree. You want to know clearly, is this good or bad? And another thing to note as well is like these experiments are running, and you will work really closely with product on this, is like, what's the total addressable market that this experiment is linked to? So if you're trying to experiment to enter into a total market, like where are we running with these? And be able to track, just be able to track that in terms of over time, we're running these experiments and these are the size of the market share that we're looking at trying to get. Investments, this is a tricky one as well, with business value of delivered features over time. This, maybe a bit of a hand wavy here of how to do this, but your product managers should be able to understand what the value is, and you should be able to really push them in terms of how much value is this driving to our existing customers. Even if it's somewhat like you could just categorize it into sort of low value or high value, or what I like to try and do with this is to sort of bucket it into 3 steps. So you can say this is value we're driving. It's table stakes. It's stuff that we need to do to be in this market that we're behind on or other competitors are doing. Is it incremental? Is it just keeping us getting better? Or how much of our investment are going to what we call sort of transformative stuff? And that kind of gives you an idea of how you're doing against your competition around where your investments are going. And then speed is an interesting one, because around innovation is like you don't want these sort of epics sitting in your backlog for a long period of time, because you kind of like moving a bit slowly there. So we like to kind of track in terms of the completed epics. So once an epic's wrapped up and done, we're like, well, how old was this? Beware with this one. If people sometimes start gaming the metrics on that by like writing them epic at the last moment. But our planning process kind of forces people not to do that. So buyer beware on this one. And I like this one here because this one is worthy of some good discussions with people, which is understanding sort of like, I call it the barriers to entry to compete with your product. And this really comes down to what's the performance of your secret sauce that you have as an organization. So if it is your ability to, let's say, I'm going to keep sharpen on the the machine learning model stuff. If you have some really powerful models that you feel are better than your competitor, you really want to be tracking how good are those models performing and what they're driving, and use that to make sure that that is in front of your executives on a regular basis, so they understand that for someone to come in the market and be better than you, they've got to be doing your secret sauce better. And this varies a lot by organization. You've really got to think about, well, what is it that we do, and how can we measure how well we do this thing? And you really have to sort of like get everyone in a room and figure that one out and what the inputs are. A few more to get through here. Sorry, I'm kind of going a little long here. Costs, very easy to do in terms of hard costs. There's a few here at the bottom there in terms of more interesting. So I like to talk about risk and really look at change of risk profile more than like what the dollar amount is, because it gets a little, people often then challenge the methodology, but if you're just going up and down, it works pretty well. So it's things like, what is the risk of our code base is often the one that I like to look at. So, do we have lots of end-of-life libraries or operating systems or other things that we're going to have to run with? Can talk a bit about the start. How fast can we get through and get our deployment stuff out? Can we adapt to potential risks that we need to? Adapt to issues that come up and be able to ship things. So things like your DORA metrics for lead time, for changes in deployment frequency are helping there. I like these other ones as well, which are sort of percentages. If we are not meeting our typical, we like to have a target tech debt percentage, and it varies kind of by team and their code base. And if teams are not actually spending enough time on this tech debt, that is a yellow flag for us, because we need to be doing our housekeeping. Similarly, maintenance burden, if that maintenance burden starts getting too high, that's questions like, what's going on here? Why are we doing this? And customer burden, and this is sort of customer specific issues. So if you're in a product team and you keep on having to get dragged into customer A wants this, customer A wants this, like you end up with that squeaky wheel customer often, and that is often then a sort of a flag that, hey, is this the squeaky wheel customer, or do we actually genuinely have a problem here? Is this customer core a core customer that focuses on our core product, or are they kind of like on the side use case and we're not dedicating enough time to it? All right, I've got one more slide lastly. So we've got all these sort of metrics flowing through. You kind of pick and choose one that makes sense. How do we make this repeatable? My first thing is start in Google Sheets, start with some raw data coming in, like write yourself instructions as you do this, because you're going to do it. And the next month you're going to come around like, where the hell did I do this? Like there's, you'll forget entirely. And really don't overinvest until you know what metrics you want and how you're going to report it up. Once you've got more of an idea, then start looking at building a pipeline. You can probably go and see my DevOps Days Boston talk. There's a link here. I'll make sure the link gets posted somewhere, or you can just Google DevOps Days Boston, Neil Davis, and you'll find me. Also, your output is only as good as your input data. So if you've got garbage in, garbage out, so Attack, Jira, or whatever it is you store a lot of metrics in, you've got to establish some good practices there, making sure people are recording things correctly with the right fields. And then last piece is you've got to democratize this data. Make sure everyone's got access to it and understand how it's being used. Engineers get a little wary if you've got like KPIs that get reported up to executives around some of this stuff. They're like, oh, am I going to get fired if this number gets bad? I often like to use it as a turnaround saying, no, this is going to enable us to actually get your message about those things that you hate and are causing us problems in front of the executives in a way in which we can understand. And then we may get more buy-in to address some of these because they understand the business impact. So make sure everyone's got access to it and they understand how it benefits them and how they can get used. And that's it. I'd like to thank you all. We're good. And I'd like to pass this back over to Amanda and go through the round of lean coffee discussions.